Okay.
Oh, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Seminar Series. I'm Dr. Janice Ranson, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Exeter Medical School, and I'm also the Reproducibility Theme Lead for IDSAI. So I'm really delighted to chair today's seminar. The seminar series covers a wide range of research themes in the field of data science and AI. And the Institute welcomes a distributed network of academics as well as Turing Fellows across the university and also further afield. So the format for today's talk is 1 hour, and we have a fantastic speaker here for you today who's going to talk for about 45 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes Q&A, where we'll all have the opportunity for a lively discussion with the speaker. So your interaction is really very much encouraged, so please do feel free to ask any questions in the chat during the talk or to put your hand up and talk at the end. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Professor Stephanie Hicks, Associate Professor in the Department of Biostatistics at Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Stephanie is working at the intersection of data science and health, and she's a faculty member of the Johns Hopkins Data Science Lab and also the Centre for Computational Biology. She's the co-host of the Corresponding Author podcast, and she's the co-founder of Our Ladies Baltimore. And she's here for us to talk about her paper on reproducibility standards for machine learning in the life sciences. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Janice. Let me push the buttons to share the screen first, and then I'll jump in. 1 second. Can somebody see the title slide? Confirm.
Yes, that looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, thank you so much again for the invitation. It's really exciting for me to be asked to talk about this paper. This is the first time that somebody reached out to have me talk about it. I will mention though that the slides were prepared by most of the slides were prepared by one of my co-authors, Michael Hoffman, who gave it talk at Banff last year. So if you saw his talk, it'll probably be pretty similar, but I thought the slides were really great. So, okay, so where to begin? So I'm, as Janice mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Biostatistics. My work focuses in many different areas. One area that I am particularly passionate about is reproducible research. And so the majority of the talk today is going to be focused on this one paper that I'm going to talk about from Ben Heel et al. It's titled Reproducibility Standards for Machine Learning in the Life Sciences. So I will jump into this for the rest of the talk. But before I did that, I also just wanted to mention a few other things about myself. So in addition to me working in the areas of reproducibility, machine learning, and life sciences, I've also written review articles about reproducible research in other domains, in particular in public health. And then also I am an associate editor for reproducibility at the Journal of American Statistical Association, JASA. It's one of our kind of flagship journals in the field of statistics. I'm happy to talk about that if anybody's interested, but that's also like another area of reproducible research that I really enjoy. And then just because I wanted to, sort of give an example that of my work, I do work, within the world of machine learning, and also I work in the world of, for example, unsupervised analyses or supervised analyses. For example, this would be one for an unsupervised analysis. It's a method I developed called mini batch k-means. It's a scalable clustering algorithm that allows you to scale clustering to millions of observations, and it was designed in application for single cell analysis. So I talk about this just to give you like a little bit of a flavor of my research before diving into why I care about reproducibility so much. So here, for example, on the x-axis, we're showing you downsampled sizes of data sets ranging from 75,000 up to 1 million cells. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the max memory used and the elapsed time on the left and the right correspondingly or respectively for 3 different algorithms. One is just k-means, kind of like Lloyd's algorithm, the vanilla algorithm that we all know and love. And then compared to mini batch k-means, which we developed for either data in memory or data on disk, shown in green and blue respectively. And here we're showing you can cluster 1 million cells and under 2 gigabytes of memory in less than 10 minutes. So it's quite impressive. So my work, expands beyond this in many different areas of genomics, many different areas of life sciences. When we think about publications in machine learning in the context of biology, you can do a search for inside of Web of Science, for a topic category of machine learning, and any of these kind of terms: biology, medicine, genome, proteome, cell, metabolic, and so forth. And you can see that with the cost of decreasing high throughput technologies, large amounts of biological data are being generated and really being made accessible to researchers. And so machine learning has become really a spotlight for us to be able to understand these genomic, proteomic, metabolic types of data to be able to develop, groundbreaking medical applications. And so this plot is showing you along the x-axis time, years along the x-axis, with the number of publications in biology that are focused with machine learning. So lots of exciting work in this space, lots of demand. And then with that comes, the need to talk about guidelines. So when we publish these papers, what do we need to report to be able to share the data, the code, the model, how we evaluate it, how we optimize these models, things like that. So while ideally machine learning methods, should be validated experimentally, this only happens in a very small amount of fractions of the publications. There is an author from Walsh et al. In 2021, and they say, we believe that the time is right for the machine learning community to develop standards for reporting these machine learning based analyses, so that it can enable critical assessment and improve reproducibility. So these authors, Walsh et al., they introduce DOME, D-O-M-E, Data Optimization Model Evaluation, which are a community-wide set of recommendations or standards for reporting supervised machine learning-based analyses as they are applied to biological studies. And again, their goal here, which is very admirable, they say that they state that broad adoption of these recommendations will help improve machine learning assessment and reproducibility. So that was in 2021. There are more of these guidelines that exist. So this one comes from the Concert 2020, or the Concert AI guidelines, and they had a publication in 2010 that stated the minimum guidelines for reporting clinical trials that are evaluating interventions with an AI component. And so I point you to this. I believe that this one has over 30 or 40 different guidelines in this particular set of standards. And then there are even more. So here's a third one called Sprint AI from Cruz Riviera et al. So I'm not going to go into too much details about these reporting guidelines. I wanted to just kind of jump into an example that maybe we're all familiar with. And if you're not, I'm happy to share a little bit about it. So there was an exciting paper that was released in 2020 that presented an AI system for screening mammography to identify breast cancer at earlier stages of the disease, when maybe the treatment can be more successful. And the authors of this paper, they assess the performance of the AI system. To assess the performance in an AI system in a clinical setting, they curated a large data set from both the UK and the US. And in this paper, they showed a really exciting absolute reduction of around 6% and 1% in the US and the UK of false positives, and around 10% and 3% of false negatives. So that was really exciting. And then they went on to show how the AI system was able to outperform human readers when it came to screening mammography. So inside of this publication, Nature Research required the authors to fill out this form, reporting summary. So this is kind of the guidelines and the minimum set of standards that Nature research requires authors to fill out. So I'm going to highlight this part in the bottom. I'm just kind of like zooming it in for us. The section around software and code and around data. So I'll start by like just highlighting a few things. The authors wrote inside of this form, the versions of the software or the packages that they used. For example, they used TensorFlow, NumPy, SciPy, and so forth. In the data analysis section, the authors wrote the code used for training these models has a large number of dependencies on internal tooling, infrastructure, and hardware, and therefore the release of the code is not feasible. The authors then go on to say in the data section that the data set that was used for this study is not publicly available, and you need to access, and you like requests or applications for access to this database can be made here. So not making it publicly available. And so the question is this fine? They've released the versions of the software packages that they use to build this AI system, but neither the code nor the data were made available. And so there was a paper from McKinney et al. In 2020 that came out after this original paper was published. I think this came out in like October of the same year. And they wrote, all experiments and implementation details are described in sufficient, or I'm sorry, this was a quote from the original authors. They said, all experiments and implementation details are described in sufficient detail in the method section to allow independent replication with non-proprietary libraries. Then there was a follow-up study that was done, Hopkins et al. In 2020. This was the one that came out in October of the same year, where they took a look at all of the details that they described in the method section of the original authors, the breast cancer screening study. And so there's a table 1, and here they're reporting, the essential hyperparameters for reproducing the study, the models. And I think the thing I want to highlight is that there are quite a few hyperparameters that we're missing that are necessary to be able to reproduce the study of these models. And the Hopkins et al., they went on to say, without this key information, independent reproduction of the training pipeline is just not possible. So while the original authors claimed everything was described in detail and sufficient detail in the method section, this really did not pan out if somebody doesn't provide these key pieces of information. So let's think about these reporting standards. So I've talked about 3 different reporting standards at this point: DOME, Consort AI, and Spirit AI. Just because I like to pick on acronyms, I'm reporting the number of characters in the acronym. So like DOME has 4, Consort AI is 10, Spirit AI is 9, and so forth. And then on a more serious note, I'm telling you the number of items that are in each one of these reporting standards. So there are 21 items that DOME talks about. There are roughly 50 in Consort AI, roughly 60 to 70 in Spirit AI. So that gives you a sense of how many standards, or like what are the different number of items in each one of these standards. They all sort of agree and disagree on various things. And so I'm going to highlight whether or not they talk about, should the data be made available, should the model be made available, or should the code be made available. So if we think about DOME, for example, the first one that I talked about, here I've got these little praise hands. This refers to basically the standard saying not required, but required to disclose non-availability, and it's recommended to make these available. So that's, okay, it's not required to make any of these available, but it's recommended, so that's good. Consort AI. So now I'm introducing two more kind of emojis. The first one is the cloud, and this one corresponds to, again, not required, but you're at least required to disclose non-availability. There is no recommendation for the cloud about whether or not you should make it available, though. And then the X corresponds, again, not required, but not even required to disclose not availability. So Concert AI, for example, is pretty loose in terms of its guidelines about data availability. It is recommending to at least disclose the non-availability of the models and the code, for example. And then Spirit AI, this last one, for example, falls into this middle category again, where again, not required to make your data, model, or code available, but required to disclose when not available. Okay, so I also want to bring in another category called reproducibility. So here we looked into each one of these reporting standards, DOME, Concert AI, Spirit AI. And there's two categories I'm going to introduce here. One is kind of like the four-leaf clover. If the authors follow the recommendations and you're lucky, and then kind of like the shrug of it's possible, but no guarantees. So Concert AI and Spirit AI, they kind of fall into this last category where, you know, reproducibility, it's possible, but there's really no guarantee that the code or that any of the analyses will be made available to be reproduced. And then the four-leaf clover, DOME does talk about this in terms of a standard of making the analyses reproducible, but there's really no mechanism for that. And it really depends on the authors themselves, just kind of following the recommendations. And if you're lucky, you would be able to reproduce the analyses. All right, so I have picked on these reporting standards for quite some time now. So what I want to introduce is this concept of shifting our mindset from reporting standards, which again, I've talked about 3 different reporting standards that exist in the literature within the last 3 years, to reproducibility standards. So what do I mean by that? An ideal reproducibility standard. Well, first, it should be functional, should not just be paperwork that we're pushing. This should enable reproducibility of the results that a set of authors publish in a paper. And what it does is it provides guarantees for the readers that something or the results in the produced manuscript will allow them to reproduce those analyses if they wished. And then another thing that my co-authors and I, when we wrote this manuscript, felt very strongly about is that reproducibility is not black and white. It fits and like falls along a spectrum or a gradient. So one could imagine making an analysis from a manuscript more reproducible or less reproducible by increasing or decreasing the amount of steps or standards that one brings to the analysis. For example, do you share your code on GitHub? Do you then include a README file where you document the order of or the analysis steps that you took? Do you also include the version numbers? So reproducibility is not black and white. And so when we thought about this, we really thought about this as a spectrum. And so we settled on kind of a bronze, silver, and gold set of levels. So here I'm showing you kind of like 3 different metals from a picture I found online. And those different levels I'm going to talk about in detail over the next kind of like 20 minutes. All of the details are in our paper called, again, Reproducibility Standards for Machine Learning in the Life Sciences. But I just wanted to like highlight the fact that reproducibility, at least in our minds, is not black and white. And authors that go for the bronze or that go for the silver or that go for the gold, you know, should be lauded and applauded for their efforts. But they're all kind of different in what one is willing to invest time in to work towards. Okay, so let's talk about the bronze standard. So this is kind of the minimum standard that we settled on. And the key things here are that the data be made available, the data be published and downloadable, that the models themselves that you're using, that you've built, be published and downloadable, and then the code that you use to build those models be published and downloadable. Okay, one second. So let's talk about sharing data. Let's talk about the data first at the bronze level. So sharing data, this is important because when data cannot be shared, models must be shared to have any hope of like computational reproducibility. If neither data nor models, which I'll talk about in a second, are shared, then the code itself is really near useless as it doesn't really have anything to operate on. So we recommend that all data sets that are used in a publication should be made available publicly, when their corresponding manuscript is first posted. It could be a preprint, it could be published as a peer review, but when the manuscript is first posted, that is when the data should be made available. And specifically, the raw form of the data that was used must be published. And when users or researchers are using maybe existing data sets, they should include information and code that was required to download and pre-process any of that data. So there are many different types of data sharing agreements, and I'm just going to talk about a few here. So here's an example of a public data sharing agreement. Data are made available in some kind of centralized repository by a sharer, by the original author. And then maybe a set of requesters, they go to that central repository and they are able to publicly access that data. So not all data can be made publicly released, of course. Some data contain, personally identifiable information, or they're restricted by a data use agreement and so forth. And in this case, data are typically stored in a controlled access repository of some kind, and users or requesters need to have specific approval or explicit approval from maybe a data access committee to approve those requests and so forth. And then, there's also the issue of training models on private data that pose privacy challenges. So this is an image that was pulled from a paper by one of my co-authors, Michael Hoffman, that was published in Nature Reviews Genetics, where he describes more details about how to make data with privacy challenges, how to share those data. So for example, you could think about taking the original participant data and making synthetic participant data, or summarizing participant data with noise, providing redacted participant data. Fortunately, model training methods that are designed to preserve privacy exist, such as differential privacy. So things like this can really help models be resistant to attacks, to uncover personally identified information. And these methods can be made available with open source libraries such as Hopkins. So researchers who are working with data with privacy constraints can and should employ these techniques as kind of like a routine practice. Now, where did the data go? So in the context of the bronze standard, this kind of depends on where the data are used. So if you think about sharing gene expression data, for example, gene expression data can often be shared in what's called the gene expression omnibus, or GEO. If you have microscopy images, there's a specialist repository called Bioimage Archive. If no specialist repository exists that are kind of unique for your type of data, there are also what we call generalist repositories. So an example would be Zenodo, where if you have a data set for, I think it's up to 50 gigabytes, could be wrong, Zenodo would be a great option for storing and sharing that data. Dryad would be an example for ones that are larger than 50 gigabytes. And I think the thing that is key here is that you're making your data available on not just, for example, a GitHub website, for example, where it really is under 100% of the author's control. You are putting it in kind of an archived website, either in a specialist repository or a generalist repository, where those data can be shared in a more free, but of course also like safe way, protecting patient privacy and so forth. Okay, so let's move on to models. So sharing trained models is like really another critical component for reproducibility. If the the code for analysis were perfectly reproducible and required no extra time for scientists to run, the model would still be need to be made available. And requiring people who wish to use the method on their own data to like retrain that model really slows the progress of science. It creates an unnecessary barrier to entry. It wastes compute time, effort for future researchers and so forth. I will also say it also, like, if you can't, being unable to like kind of examine the model makes it difficult to trust the results. And so without access to the model, it's really hard to say whether a model fails to generalize to other data sets, fails to make fair decisions across demographic groups such as age, nationality, and so forth, or if the model is learning to make predictions based on just artifacts in the data. Okay, so where do models go? In terms of the bronze standard, it's a very similar type of recommendations as to the data. So there are a set of specialist repositories, when possible. So an example would be for genomics or single cell genomics, there's a whole set of repositories. And then there are also a set of generalist repositories like Zenodo that I mentioned before, and making the models themselves available solely on a non-archived website such as GitHub really does not fulfill this requirement. You need to go and deposit it in some kind of specialist or generalist repository that's not under 100% of the author's control. Okay, the last thing I'll touch on in the bronze section is the code itself. So from a reproducibility standpoint, the source code is as critical as its methods section of a manuscript. Source code, it contains implementation details that a future author is unlikely to be able to replicate exactly from just the methods description or the tables that are provided. Small deviations from this, they can lead to big differences in the original work from the authors and reproduced ones. This is kind of course, ignoring the burden of having to re-implement an entire analysis from scratch and so forth. So for the computational components of the study, just code is a better way of describing the work than often the methods itself. So as a result, computational papers without code should kind of meet a similar level of skepticism, similar to papers without method sections. Where do you put the code? So in terms of the bronze standard, the idea is very similar. You can deposit it in third-party or generalist archivable repositories such as Zenodo. This includes the code for training, tuning, testing models, creating figures, processing data, generating finalized results. One way of doing this, as I mentioned, is Zenodo. doing so, it gives the persistence of, like when you deposit this in Zenodo, for example, it really gives a persistence that's required by the scholarly literature for further development and use. And I will just mention here, often people deposit their code in GitHub. While the point is, it's not sufficient to just put this on GitHub. It would be sufficient, though, to deposit this on GitHub and then create a versioned repository of that by using Zenodo, for example. So you can, for example, create version numbers with Zenodo, with the combination of Zenodo and GitHub, which is the key idea here. Okay, so silver standard. So it's kind of like the bronze standard plus. What is the plus here? So, while it's possible to reproduce an analysis with just the data, just the models, and just the code, this alone is, not easy. But there are some best practices from the field of software engineering that can make reproducing analyses easier. So some examples would be using a package management tool to record analysis details and control randomness. So, a reason why you might be interested in this is because you can hit roadblocks if you try to reproduce an analysis and you just are getting different results due to different versions of those packages. And in fact, sometimes if you try to reproduce analysis with a different version of the software package, you might not be able to reproduce the results at all, depending on how different the software, the versions are of the software. Okay, so I mentioned kind of dependency management tools. So some examples that you might be familiar with are PackRat, Composite, or Conda. These can really eliminate difficulties for both the authors and others kind of seeking to build upon the original work and tracking which versions are being used. There are also container systems that you can use, such as Docker. I think that's the most popular one. It allows you to specify the whole system that was used to run the code, more than just the versions of the key software packages. And this idea of containerization, it really does provide better guarantees of reproducing a software analysis, but it also has its limitations. So specifically, it doesn't tolerate so much modest, it can be difficult to have moderate environmental changes. So I mean, this brittleness that you might call it, it can be difficult for future researchers to then use or to build upon the original analysis. So, we recommend that authors using container also ensure that their code works on a latest version of at least one operating system and so forth. Okay, so analysis details. So I'm diving in a little bit more into the silver level here. Knowing the steps to run an analysis is really a crucial part of reproducing it, but this part I find is often not formally recorded very often. And I will say it takes far less time for the original authors to document factors such as the order of an analysis components or information about the computers that were used. It takes far less time for the original authors to document all this information than to have a third party attempt to reproduce it or attempt to guess that information on their own. So with that in mind, the silver standard requires that the authors record the order in which one should run the analysis components, such as the operating system that was used to produce the work, the time it took to run the code, and things like that. Also things like the types of CPUs or GPUs that were used, the amount of RAM that was required, for example. So you can record this information in a variety of ways. You could record this information in a README file. You could add numbers to the beginning of each of the script's names, like 01, 02, 03, and so forth. Or you could provide kind of like a run all script where you tell explicitly the order that the various scripts were run under. And then again, as I mentioned before, it's really important for authors to include details such as the operating system, the wall clock, the CPU running time, resources that are necessary to run the code, and things like that, all within like a README file. Okay, the last thing I'll touch on in the silver section before moving on to the gold is randomness. And this is a challenge, of course, that I find is very common in machine learning analyses. So when we talk about data splitting, when we talk about neural network initialization, even some GPU kind of like parallelized math, all of these include elements of randomness. This is, I think, widely used in machine learning. And because, these models depend on this randomness component, we need pseudo-random number generators to be seeded to be able to provide kind of consistent results. How the seeds are set depends on the language. I won't go into that here, but the authors should take, special care when you're working with deep learning libraries, for example. I find current implementations often don't prioritize these details, especially when you're using kind of like accelerated operations on GPUs. But there are some frameworks that have options to kind of like mitigate non-deterministic operations. For example, in PyTorch, there's this very nice note where they talk about randomness. And, this might become less of an issue and have more fully deterministic operations in the future. But for now, like the best way for this type of randomness to deal with this type of randomness is to just publish the trained models themselves and so forth. Okay, gold standard. So this is the final standard that I'll introduce here. This really requires the entire analysis to be reproducible within a single command. How do you achieve that? Or what does that mean? So achieving that goal sounds very lofty. It essentially requires the authors to automate all the steps of their analysis, including downloading the data, pre-processing the data, training models, producing output tables, and generating annotating figures. Full automation stands in addition to tracking dependencies and making their code available. And I mean, the best way to summarize this is that if an author decides, or a set of authors decide to go for the gold, so to speak, you really are reducing the burden of future authors to try and reproduce the original author's analyses as much as possible. So there are some workflow management softwares that allow you to do this, kind of like all in one button, such as SnakeMake or Nextflow. This really will streamline the work of meeting the gold standard. If you're not familiar with these tools, they essentially help the authors create a series of rules. I mean, the terms kind of vary between the different management softwares, but they essentially allow you to create a set of rules that run all the components in an analysis. Now, of course, you could try to do this in like a simple shell script. This also could also feasibly accomplish the goal, but there are some advantages that workflow management softwares provide. So for example, workflow management softwares really make it easy to restart analyses after errors. It makes it easy to parallelize analyses or track the progress of an analysis as it's going through its workflow. And I'll also mention second that sometimes it can take a long time for a set of analyses to run, like so much that it's really like infeasible for a set of authors to try and reproduce the original work from a study. And so in those cases, authors should try to store and publish intermediate outputs so that like you could verify the final results, even if you can't reproduce the entire pipeline and so forth. So again, these workflow management systems really help in this area because they allow you to use this like kind of like partial reproduction in a very straightforward way by tracking these intermediate outputs and using them to reproduce the final results. Okay, so this is the final table that we put all together for the proposed reproducibility standards stratified by bronze, silver, and gold. I've talked about all of these in pretty great detail, so if you want to know more about them, I encourage you to check it out. So the final takeaway here I wanted to mention, when we compare against the original reporting standards, go for the gold, right? So we want to enable reproducibility for the studies that are building these machine learning algorithms in life sciences. Now, one question I often get, which is also very important to talk about, is like, how do you make reproducibility a priority, right? This is all great, but like, how do we make this happen? Well, okay, so one question you could ask is like, what is the most important aspect of evaluating research output? So in terms of quantity, one might think about using the number of publications. If we use, popularity metrics, so the number of citations to other papers, the number of downloads, the number of tweets, the number of media mentions that someone talks about. And a question that I have is like quality, like how do we evaluate the quality of the research output? And this matters in a variety of ways. So like the evaluation of quality, for example. So when institutions evaluate research, they're often doing this maybe at the researcher level, or maybe they're doing this at the organization level. If we think about researchers, this comes up, for hiring, annual reviews, promotion reviews, and things like that. And so if we dig into this like further about evaluating researchers, whenever we are evaluating, whenever I get a request to evaluate somebody's promotion packet, typically I get, a submitted list of article names and journal names, and not really information about the quality or the impact of those publications. And so whenever we are asked to evaluate researchers, for example, in a promotion setting, articulating the quality and the impact of those publications is key. And one way to be able to do that is to point to a formal set of standards that were met. And to answer the question, how are the data and materials reused by others? So these reproducibility standards could be pointed to. For example, you could imagine like having a publication saying, I met the bronze level by the Heal It All paper, for example, or I met the silver level, I met the gold level. And I'll mention like these criteria have already been adapted by foundations. So this is one foundation that has adapted it, the Alex Lemonade Stand Foundation. I point you to some links if you want to know, but they really go in and ask some of these very similar types of questions, thinking and describing it, not formally with the term of like bronze, silver, and gold, but thinking about those same questions and those same criteria that I talked about. And in fact, the foundation actually asks applicants to provide information explicitly, like how have you shared your data publicly, not just upon request? How have you shared protocols openly, not just upon request, and so forth. Okay, so the call to action is, as you are building machine learning algorithms for the life sciences, I encourage you to claim and to write in the in your kind of like the back matter of your publication, whether or not your analyses met bronze, silver, or gold in kind of like the availability section. And what this does is it signals reproducibility best practices in terms of and why this is important. And so you can think about this in the context of paper reviews, grant reviews, and hiring, and so forth. Okay, and that's all I have. I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time and your attention. Thank you very much to the co-authors of the manuscript, in particular, Ben Heel, who led a lot of this work, and the generous funding support from NIH and Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a really brilliant talk, and very interesting and super clear. So I'd encourage everyone at this point to turn your camera on and be willing to engage in a bit of a discussion. It's a bit more fun that way than a lot of black screens. Does anyone have any particular questions for Stephanie at the moment? I have a couple, but we've got a hand up. We've got Chris Playford. Do you want to unmute Chris and dive in?
I was actually applauding for
Oh.
at that moment, and that was me attempting to use buttons. There we go. But
No worries.
No, I'm not sure I had a specific question because I was about to. I'm a social scientist. I don't work with machine learning particularly. I mostly just fit statistical models to look at educational outcomes. And I suppose I do have a question. I work with data that you have to apply to access, and then you have to in order to release results from those data, I have to go through statistical disclosure control, and that's always a bit of a challenge in terms of reproducibility because of things like, as you've highlighted, like suppression of numbers when they're too low and they think that people are identifiable in these situations. In terms of practical things, I'm not sure if we necessarily have had those kind of synthetic data sets to release with this. Have you got any tips or suggestions?
So I guess one thing I have noticed is that these, like, for example, synthetic data or like the best practices for these hit different fields over time. So they have now hit the field of genetics, for example, and they've sort of are starting to be adopted there. So I'm not familiar with the social sciences, but I can imagine that if they haven't sort of been embraced by that community yet, then one of the best things you could do would be to sort of write a review article that enables awareness and education for these types of best practices that do exist in other fields, and bring them to the social sciences and bring software and tools that enable that synthetic data to be more widely available in the social sciences. But I don't work in the social sciences, but these tools and these ideas can be easily adopted, I'm sure, in other fields.
Yeah, I but that was funny. I have actually attempted. I've got.
Okay, that's exciting to hear.
Yeah, no, it is. But on the other hand, I think the progress is glacially slow. But no, I still think what we're trying to do is a good thing. So, yeah.
Thank you for your comment and question.
One of the things I really liked about this, Stephanie, is that the logical shift from reporting guidelines to reproducibility. It kind of follows the shift in responsibility away from just the author that's submitting that paper at the end. So I just wondered, from your perspective, to what extent does that responsibility then we start to think about funders and data owners? Because it's not usually, with this kind of data at least, the person writing that paper and submitting it to the journal is not usually the data owner. And they're not usually the person that put together that cohort and created all those rules around that. So I'm kind of sympathetic to the researchers that write in that box, oh, I don't know, we don't own the data, so we can't give it to you. Here's the link for how to apply for it. I'm kind of sympathetic to that, but I wonder if it could be a bit more joined up, where these standards are considered when someone is putting together an application to fund the collection of a new cohort. What can you do within the realms of the ethics of that to be able to, put together things like the synthetic data, the de-anonymized data. I just wondered what your idea was of who's got responsibility now.
I do. So to your point, I do feel very strongly that journals or funders could have a much stronger role in this area, in the sense that if we all can sort of agree upon a set of standards for what is or is not reproducible, for example, at these 3 levels that I'm proposing, it makes it easier then for journals and funders, for example, to get behind this. Even if you don't own the data yourself, we fully acknowledge that not all data can be made publicly available. But even if you can, for example, say, I have met these standards as described, for example, by the bronze level, even if the data cannot be made fully publicly available. But you could, for example, say I've met some minimum bar by making synthetic data available, or then I feel like the whole conversation will go a lot easier, and it's easier for journals and funders to get behind that, right? Because at the moment, it's there are not a lot of like reproducibility standards that a journal can point to and say, this is what we are requiring. And so it moves the bar up in terms of enabling more reproducibility, and it kind of like makes it more obvious and understandable like what those standards are. And then it helps the journals, in my opinion, helps the journals, and it would help the funders, for example, say like, we require authors meet the bronze level, you know, with exceptions if data are not being made available. Like then you should, for example, consider making synthetic data. So I guess like, I think it's a good opportunity for journals and funders to like have more say in this process, kind of like raising the bar, but I don't know, we'll see.
Great. David, I think your hand was up next.
Oh, thank you. Stephanie, I wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
So you talked about making things easier and quicker for people replicating the work of others. But is there a danger that we're generating a lot of additional work for the people doing the original research? And if that research is never taken on by others, to what extent are we reducing the efficiency of the discoveries we make? I know it's probably an unreasonable point of view, but I wondered if you'd thought about that.
Yes. So first, I want to just provide clarity. In my mind, I think of reproducibility and replicability as two different things in my mind. So in my mind, reproducibility is focused on taking the code and the data and the models that were developed like from a publication and just being able to simply reproduce those results, as opposed to, in my mind, replicability, thinking about like gathering a new data set from a different set of authors and investigating that same question and see if they come up with the same results. I just wanted to like, okay. So I think in terms of reproducibility, simply looking and providing like the data, the code, and the models for an analysis, it really, in my mind, comes down to like how much we can trust those results and whether or not, for example, we're not just finding artifacts in the data and things like that. I find the effort that goes towards making your work reproducible really goes very far in the scientific community. If you can invest the time and energy to just simply reproduce the analyses of your work. And again, reproducibility in my mind is not a gradient, is not a black and white. Yes, no, it's a gradient. And so you could choose to do a small amount, you could choose to do a large amount. And it's entirely up to you as authors, you know, to what extent you are interested in investing energy towards making your analyses reproducible. Some individuals or researchers may value that more or less. We acknowledge that. And it's, again, it's not black and, in my opinion, it's not black and white. But the point I'm trying to make is providing a set of standards, just like the level, a set of bars that we can all sort of say like, yes, I know what bronze means, or yes, I know what silver means. Then when I look at that paper and I see, for example, the tag that says, we have met the silver bar of reproducibility standards by Heal et al., then I have an idea of what that means, and I can immediately then jump into that scientific work and understand how much reproducibility the authors were able to provide. I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't know. I agree with you. I see the benefits to that kind of approach. I think maybe it speaks to the earlier comment from Janice about, you know, really buying into this would involve a shift in mentality, and that needs to be reflected in things like the way projects are funded, so that there's probably more time allocated to the development of reproducible research I think otherwise the problem is, you spoke about things like promotion and so on. Raw productivity is a really important metric when making things like tenure decisions. Absolutely. And if you have 3 papers that are bronze level in terms of reproducibility, if the alternative is 6 papers that don't get into that, then it puts people in a really difficult position, doesn't it? That was my point, I guess.
So, okay, I hear you on both the funding aspect of wanting or needing to have additional funding. If one decides to invest in this, then like one would need additional funding and time and support and like resources to make that happen. I totally agree with you, and this is not going to happen overnight. And then in the context of promotion, yes, I agree with you that this is not going to happen overnight. At the moment, we have quantity as one of the main factors of criteria for promotion, for example. That being said,
Stephanie, sorry, I'm going to interrupt just because we've only got a few minutes left.
Oh gosh, sorry.
More questions, and I feel like we're going off to a slight tangent. So if I can just rudely move the conversation on, just so that we've got an opportunity for others as well. Natasha, did you want to dive in with your question?
Thank you. Yeah, awesome talk. I just wondered if you could quickly touch on GitHub a bit more, the limitations of it, because as someone who's fairly new to this, I sort of see GitHub used as the main way to do this reproducible work by authors. And so would it go sort of GitHub, container, Zenodo? Is that kind of the hierarchy?
So GitHub, it does allow you to share your code. The thing that happens, or data, or whatever your models, whatever you're sharing. The thing is, it's entirely under the author's control. So at any given point in time, the authors could like remove that repository the day after the publication is made available, right? So then it's lost, unless somebody decided to preserve that. So if you then make your code tracked with a DOI, for example, by versioning it with Zenodo, you are putting it on a third-party platform that guarantees the persistence over time, as opposed to something being entirely under the author's control. For sure, like, if the author keeps that GitHub repository over time and, the version stays there and it changes over time, there's technically nothing wrong with it. But the challenge is it's entirely under the author's control, and that can be removed in a whim.
Okay, so that's the main limitation. Yeah. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Richard, I think you had your hand up next.
Oh, I think Cedric was before me.
Oh, thank you, Richard. I'm sorry I don't have the camera. For some reason, Zoom doesn't want to show me. Well, so in my last project, I've got 4 comments to run the whole experimentation. Is that gold standard then?
You've got 4 comments? Sorry, what does that mean?
4 comments instead of, does it really need to be 1 comment?
Does rain? Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay. Does it really need to be just 1 command, or can it be 4
We've only
commands?
got 1 minute, so if you could try to keep it brief, that would be great.
Okay, another question. Is it really necessary to be able to run the code? Is that what makes it reproducible? Isn't it more important to have the algorithms that were used and that it's well explained in the paper? Because I don't see how it's useful that people can just run the experiment and verify that the code that has been written does the same thing that is in the paper, whereas the code could be wrong. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so the idea is just to share the code, share the models, share the data. It's not like I have to. It's just that if somebody wanted to in the future, they could run the code, or they could explore the original results that were presented by the author. But the idea is that you provide all details about the code that's necessary. For example, at the bronze level, including versions of the software packages or the order of operations that were used to run the scripts. At the bronze level, it would be just the code itself, the models that you built, and the data itself, as opposed to running the code. I apologize if I didn't make that clear.
No, it's just I just think the algorithms are more important than the versions of the software that is being used. But
for
I'll
sure,
let-
the
I'll
methods
let time
themselves,
for
the
Richard.
algorithms themselves are typically published in the manuscript, like the development of a novel algorithm. I'm talking about the reproducibility of the work, which is slightly different than like the development of a new algorithm, which I agree with you is like very exciting and important in its own right, but it's a slightly different question.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay, I think we'll move on to Richard's question, which will be the last question for today.
Well, I've just got to, I suppose, I'm not sure if it's a comment. It's really a comment on the same sort of lines as David's comment, I think, which is, first of all, the Association for Computing Machinery publishes, I'm sure you know, a series of badges for artifacts. And I'm just trying to put that, yeah, there it is. I've just put it into the chat if anyone's interested. But my comment about it is that the amount of effort involved in preparing for one of those badges is quite large on two sides. One on the author's side, and I know for a paper of mine, a postdoc put an awful lot of work into making sure that it was reproducible to that standard. I think that was a very good thing to do, but it took a lot of work. And then it also took a lot of work on the review side. And the journal which published it, then invested quite a lot of effort in reviewing the code. They didn't get as far as running it because they wouldn't have had the computational resources to do it for free. I mean, we burned, I won't tell you how many thousands of hours in producing that, and there wasn't actually any data involved there. So I just wanted to make the comment that there is a big effort, and perhaps this has to be driven by journals. Isn't that where the pull is going to come from? Is from journals?
In terms of like code review, I for sure agree that like that takes a lot of time and effort, especially if a journal is then expecting a reviewer to go through the code line by line, for example. My point is like to meet the bronze level, it's on like the goal would be for the authors to just simply provide the code, the models, and the data that were used to meet the bronze level, for example. Or if you don't want to meet the bronze level, the goal would be to then just provide just the code, for example, to enable the possibility for reproducibility in the future. I'm like, if journals decide that they want to do line by line code review, then that's of course up to the journal, which again, like we could have that discussion like outside of this. And I think that's a really interesting discussion. But my point is just trying to describe the set of standards that we could all sort of like agree upon to be able to say, did the authors like share their code? Did the authors share their data? Did the authors share their models? And of course, like it's a time and effort to create that or to like share that information. But you also created that information to be able to produce the manuscript, hopefully. And so if you can then just share the data, then you meet this minimum bar above a bronze level, which then the journal itself could then decide like to what extent they want to review the code line by line and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I guess we're also starting to get to the point where we talk about replicability, where it's not your code that reproduces it, but it's somebody else's implementation.
That's another fascinating discussion that I'd be happy to have like another time. Yeah.
But thank you. It was really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. So it's been a really, really good debate and discussion. I think we'll have to wrap up because we've already gone over a little bit. So thank you again, Stephanie. I guess the proof will be in the pudding as to how many people take this forward. But I do agree with Richard that the journals are going to have to kind of force us in some way to do that. And I think as long as we're having those conversations with the data owners and the funders and the journals together, I think maybe that's the way forward. But it's a really, really amazing start, and it's a really good piece of work. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, I don't know how to do the digital round of applause thing. Last time I did that, I ended up putting my hand up, and it was really embarrassing. So I won't do that this time. Oh look, loads of people know how to do it. That's amazing. Okay. The next event in this seminar series is on the 15th of February. So everyone who's on the mailing list for this, I'm sure, will receive more information from Emily and Helen. So yeah, thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to Stephanie.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
lovely day,
Thank you so much
everyone.
for your time and all the great questions. I had a lot of fun. Thanks.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Stephanie. Bye.